I've made animation videos about rain and waves on a beach, but not yet on a more general approach to how you can animate water. Since water is so complex and has so many ways it can behave, there isn't just one trick or method that can be applied in every situation, but I'll show a few different methods you can use for getting these varying results. For this first animation, I want the water to fall down these short waterfalls. There's a few different simple effects to add to this, starting with the splash at the bottom of each drop. This can be a loop of about 3 to 5 frames, depending on your frame rate and preference for the speed that it plays. In many cases for animation, you want your frames to feel like they fit and flow together, but here it's better to do the opposite, making each frame of the splash relate as little as possible to the others. If you have water splashing up in a certain spot in one frame, make it splash up more in a different area in the next. Same with any droplets you include flying up, it's generally a good idea to avoid placing them near where you had them in the previous frame. Only if you're using a lot of frames and a high frame rate should you consider making a specific splash or droplet continue into the next frames, because it otherwise makes the motion look unnaturally slow and awkward. Water starts to look a lot more like water when you add these lighter edges to where it meets the surrounding terrain. It should have this wobbling, varying in thickness, and it looks best when you approach it in the same way as the splashes, just a few frames that are all different from one another. Now we have the illusion that the water is flowing. The last thing I'll add to this example is a shine on the water, at the tops of where the water drops down. These shapes are small, pointy, and should vary in their horizontal length. Yet again, this should be a loop that feels random and jittery. Here's the final result. This next animation will have a continuous motion rather than being made up of only random effects. But first, it could use the same jittering light edges that the previous animation had. Draw in these hexagon-like shapes that vary in size and are most thick in areas where the lines connect. Unless the view is looking straight down at the water, they'll need to be a bit flattened to match the perspective, and I recommend making them overall pretty big if you don't want animating this to take a long time. In a new frame, draw the same thing but with the shapes in different places. Now it looks like the water is moving, but you can't tell what direction yet. Like I've demonstrated before for different types of effects in other videos, the next step is to add in-between frames that connect these first two. Decide on a direction for the water to flow, and do your best to draw how these shapes can connect. My next frame is shown in red, so I'm finding ways to connect the green shapes to the red shapes. Since my water is flowing towards the right, I'm only drawing the between shapes to the right of the green. You'll probably need to have shapes start to appear, or ones start to shrink and disappear in order to make this work. Check that it flows together and that you didn't accidentally make any part of it move in the wrong direction, and then you can either keep adding in between frames or call it here. To finish off this animation, I've added some splashing effects to where the water is flowing against these rocks, and then I temporarily removed the main flowing animation to add reflections. Get a color that is either a darker variant of the base water color, in this case blue, or you could also use a color more similar to the color of what is being reflected, which is what I've decided to go with here. Paint in the reflecting shapes of what you have at the water's edge, and this is another probably 3 to 5-ish frame loop with jittering, wobbling edges. You might prefer to stick with this as your full animation, but I'll bring back the flowing water for mine. This last one I want to do is the most complex, but is very satisfying to pull off. First, think of the motion as a simple wave like this. At its highest, it's pointed, but otherwise is rounded. As the wave goes down, the two areas on either side of it rise up a bit, and as it goes back up, those areas sink back down. Now take this motion and give it a clockwise or counterclockwise rotation. It travels one direction as it goes down and the other as it goes back up to complete the loop. If you then duplicate or redraw this a few times, you can then have additional waves that vary slightly in size. Place them randomly, not evenly spaced between each other, and offset the frames so that they are each at a different stage in the motion. Next, extend the lines of each wave and figure out how to overlap and connect them together. Now it's starting to look like a convincing body of water, but could use more detail inside of it. Draw in some foam with these shapes that are made up of curves that end in points. Be sure to put foam at the tops of your pointed waves, and think about the 3D form of the water. The foam on areas where the water is instead flattened or sinking down will also look flattened in perspective. Think of these foam shapes as like objects bobbing up and down in the water, staying in roughly the same general area. When a wave goes up, it will pinch the foam up and inward, and when that wave goes back down, the foam will travel back back down and outward. A shape that starts at the top of a wave doesn't need to stay at the top edge of the water when it sinks down, and I think it looks better when the shape separates itself from that top line. Add your shapes frame by frame and be creative with how they might connect and break apart from each other. All these lines start to get confusing to look at, so rather than just turning on onion skin, you should also frequently jump back and forth between your frames to figure out what to do next and to check that everything is flowing together well. It also becomes much easier to spot mistakes once you add color, so feel free to do that pretty early on. The final layer of detail is a darker color that shows the form of the water. Compared to everything else, this step is pretty easy. You can add it in areas where the water is sloped, and maybe underneath some of the foam to make it look less flat. I've added a new $5 tier to my Patreon that includes all previous tier benefits, such as my brushes and permanent access to my Discord server, as well as monthly sketchbook PDFs, and your name featured in this box. Shout out to the current sole owner of the box, and everyone else who has or is supporting me through Patreon. This is a great way to support me continuing to make these tutorials, so consider checking that out if you like what I do. Thanks for that, and thanks for watching.